My name is Jared McCann. I'm a principal lecturer in St Mary's University College of Queen's University, Belfast. And also I am the co-convener of the Education Working Group in the Development Studies Association of Ireland. We are here today to listen to an esteemed academic lecturer who has worked for many decades in development studies and who has an insight into economic inequality and also into specifically African development. What I will do is I'll hand over to Howard, who has a presentation here, and beyond that, we will have a few questions at the end, and we will, as I say, have this recorded, and it will be posted on the various DSAI sites, as in the DSAI site, but also university links and various other attendant organizations. So, Professor Howard Stein. Howard's professor in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, Department of Epidemiology at the University of Michigan. He's a development economist, educated in Canada, the US, and the UK, and has taught in Asia and Africa. He's editor and author of more than a dozen books and edited collections and more than 100 journal articles, book chapters, and reviews. Some of Howard's books are standard texts in terms of the field of development economics, and he is currently in Ireland North and South, giving a number of talks and also visiting some of our NGOs working in the field. So without too much ado, I will hand over to Howard, and also I will put up the PowerPoint, which should work for it. You've got it.
There we go.
Yes. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Jared. And I want to just by beginning of my talk, thank so many people that have been involved in groups and departments. I very much thank Dr. Jared McCann for inviting me up here and hosting us, and already given me a very warm welcome and amazing political tour of this fine city. Also, Petanella Peters is the director of the Development Studies Association of Ireland, who hosted my talk in Dublin, and also once again is present with us today. Miriam Ryan, who set up so much of the talk, University of Limerick, and administrative stuff, part of it, and organizing it. My old friend, Dr. Corey Carmody from Trinity College, Department of Geography, also running the Masters in Development Practice. And of course, three main organizations involved with inviting me here. A very warm welcome: the Development Studies Association of Ireland, the Department of Foreign Affairs of Ireland, and the Irish Aid. And so, once again, thank you very much for everybody for inviting me and for giving me an opportunity. I always like the platform, and we'll try to enjoy this one and perhaps talk a bit about a subject which is of great importance, I hope, and one that is definitely very pertinent, both within Africa and worldwide. So can I get this to move it? Yeah. Okay, thanks, Chris. Okay.
Sorry,
Space?
We're down at the bottom here.
Okay, there it is. Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk about income equality in Africa, and focusing not only on the continent itself, but contextualizing the developments in Africa relative to global trends. I also want to talk is the kind of dominant mainstream view of inequality and why it is so problematic. Just see if I can get this in. How do I do this anymore? I should press this a little thing.
Yeah, that should come up the bottom.
Sorry, I'm a bit technically compromised there. Let me see if we can get that Sorry. There it is. Okay, yeah, so I just have to keep pushing that.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, let's keep it at the bottom.
Yeah.
And then I want to talk about a different theoretical approach and understanding, which I think provides a more powerful understanding of the dynamics of the inequality globally within Africa. And looking at it in the context of the transformation of the global structures of trade, distribution, and finance, and how that has feed into the dynamics of inequality as well. So it's I'm not doing a good job. Maybe you should do quick and look at that. Thanks. You gotta click up that first. Okay, thanks. So next one. So debates on Africa in recent decades have often focused on the patterns of economic growth. Often there has been bold assertions of Africa going through a growth tragedy or all of a sudden a growth miracle, depending on what years one is observing, who is employing the person making these statements, and perhaps what beverage of choices at the time. Okay, I don't have to do this. Okay. And what I will one thing that has been less stressed in the discussions and debates is the patterns of distribution on the continent, arguably due to the overwhelming influence of mainstream economics, neoclassical approach, which often sees the patterns as simply a natural outcome and a positive sign that things are working. And that comes out to some degree out of its very problematic theory of distribution. And while documenting some of the trends, what I want to do is point to a very different interpretation. Because in observing trends, one has to understand the causes. And in the process of designating the causes, one in turn should see how disturbing those causal dimensions are. It reflects to some extent the disturbing patterns underneath which create these inequalities and reproduce and exacerbate these inequalities. And so I'll start by looking at the global trends in Africa. And what you can see here is, this is a very long array, all the way from the early part of the 19th century, rise, and then what was in fact a period of quite remarkable movement in the world, kind of dominated by Keynesian economics, concerns of growth and development and shared growth and development, patterns of state intervention. And what we saw was a decline of this top 1%, some improvement for the bottom of 1%, but then basically a reversal after the late 70s, early 1980s. And the question is, has that been widespread? Yes, if we look at the percentage of the share of national income from 1980 into the 2000s and well into the teens, we see every single country, the worst being, of course, the United States of America, where the largest share of growth the largest growth into the share of the upper 1%, which has been very, very widespread. And what we see here is that Africa has not been spared the same pattern, up among the highest in the entire world, the top 10% share, in a manner which is not predicted by mainstream neoclassical economics. We'll talk about that. And so what's happened in Africa has happened elsewhere in some ways, even worse. If we look at the ratio of the top 10 to the bottom 50% of the income, what we have here is in this particular case, the top 10% having extremely high ratios. Deep red is mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, some other regions as well, indicating extreme patterns of income inequality. And then we look at the top 10% income share across the world, once again, dark blue, ranging from 49 to 83%. Again, much of sub-Saharan Africa to the south and middle parts, illustrating the same patterns of extreme maldistribution of income. And once again, the flip side, yellow 3 to 12% of national income, the share for those that are under 50%. Again, the flip side of high income growth, high income to the richest, and increasing share of the income, and smaller for the poor. And we can see this in the concentrations of wealth. The upper income groups gaining the largest percentage growth of wealth. Income feeds into wealth. We'll see this in more detail in a minute. And you can see that the richest, the percentage share of the growth of the richest 0.001% being obscene all the way to 5% of the entire growth, whereas the lower income classes getting much smaller percentages, the growth only 3%. And so the bottom percent, 50% captured only 2% of the global wealth growth for 1990 to 2021. That's extraordinarily disturbing. And a pattern of income. Once again, we have a rising share of wealth owned by the 0.01% and billionaires, again, rising very, very rapidly through the 90s and the 2000s. And we look at this in the context of the extreme wealth receiving 0.001%, as much as 6% of some of the growth in particular years, and the bottom 1% getting consistently lower in 2%. And so we look at the world map, wealth map. Once again, vast majority of African countries are in the lowest, earning less than $5,000 in wealth. What this means, in essence, is that when wealth is so low, your capacity to deal with the shocks in your life are simply non-existent. Because in essence, what happens is you get driven back into poverty because you really have no savings to draw upon in dealing with these shocks. We look at the percentage of the national income share across the world, 2016. Once again, Sub-Saharan Africa up among the worst in the world, comparable to a country with extreme maldistribution of income, Brazil. And so the continent as a whole, it looks very much like Brazil, which is very, very, very disturbing. And again, the rise in the across the board in the income shares over this time, over the period of time in all of these countries. It's a pattern both in the developed and developing world. What's particularly disturbing in this case is it looks at the 10% national income share. And what we find here is one country which now has the worst income distribution in the world is South Africa, actually in Africa, with a massive increase in the share of national income over the period of the post-apartheid period. Incredibly disturbing, but a pattern we see throughout the world as the upper 10% income getting the largest shares. And once again, even more extreme in the case of the 1%. So whereas these groups got very small shares in the post-war period, those have rise very, very rapidly in terms of the share of the national income. And once again, we can see the outcome curve of global inequality and the top 1% over the period of 1980 to 2020, over a 40-year period, captured 23% of total growth. I mean, that's just obscene. And middle income particularly were hurt very dramatically. There's some rise in emerging countries, and this kind of reflects that China, we're getting lower income groups increasing their share. It does not necessarily include Africa, as we'll see. But the notion that prosperity is spread is just non-existent, and the upper 23%, the upper 1% got 23% of the total cash. And we can see this is across the board. The share of global growth captured by income groups between 1980 to 2016, basically. And what we find, of course, is Russia being the worst, where the oligarchic regime in the after the end of the Soviet Union, particularly the bottom 50% lost 24% of the share, which is really extraordinary. In other areas, once again, the top 1% getting 69%, top 10%, 117%. So just a huge redistribution of income beyond even growth to the total mass. But again, once again, we see this across the board. And this gives us our Gini, which is a measure of the degree of income disparity. Anything above 0.5 is considered to be extremely unequal wealth. But what we find is every country in the world is lower than the global Gini coefficient. And so, and of course, that's not surprising given the huge divide in the world and income level. So the Gini is all above 0.7 here. The earlier period is just an illustration of what transpires here. Now, I want to look very quickly at wealth. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. And we find that wealth distribution is generally worse than income distribution. So we look here at the share of total income of wealth. And so what we have here is we have the share of total income, basically, what we find here is we find that the top 10% getting 52% of the income, and the bottom 50% getting getting 8.5, but in wealth it's 76 versus 2. So we can see the divide in wealth is a lot worse than the divide in income. And this gives us an idea of the distribution of world national income and wealth in terms of the purchasing power. The bottom 50% basically having an average of only 2,900 in PPP terms of wealth, incredibly small worldwide, and just the obscene levels of the control of wealth. Basically, average wealth, per annual income per adult is over 1 billion, the top 0.1%, and wealth an average of 14 billion. So that's really an extraordinary divide in the world between the highest and the lowest. And this gives us our average income shares in the world. Once again, sub-Saharan Africa is 31% on average relative to the global income average. North America, 315%. And once again, we look at the divided wealth, and we see that sub-Saharan Africa on average has only 17% of the global average of wealth. Incredibly poor, globally still the poorest region by far, but also having this enormous divide in terms of income inequality and income wealth. And so we go to the next slide. Okay, let's go to this. I think I have to look here. Okay, here we go. And so we have here the extreme concentration of capital, wealth inequality, the bottom 50% in different regions. So sub-Saharan Africa, the worst in terms of the very small percentages of the bottom of wealth relative to the top 10%. Up there, not far off of where Russia is in Central Asia. So really quite extraordinary situation. And our global millionaires, there are nine individuals with more than $100 billion, which is amazing at one extreme. And we look at the average wealth then, and so you can just see the huge amounts of wealth for thousands of people and very extreme low levels of wealth. And you can see, of course, the global wealth tax rate, how low it is across the entire domain, simply not being taxed, simply being reproduced. And I just want to show this last slide on the growth of wealth at the top. COVID-19 has exacerbated wealth. So what has ended up happening basically is the upper 1% or so has gone all the way up to increasing their wealth from an average 51.9 to 62.5 million. And so what has happened is that over this period of COVID, the situation has exacerbated the maldistribution of income. Very quickly, then we move to the transformation of distribution in Africa. Are things getting worse? Sadly, the rents curve, which gives us the percentage of the population getting a good percentage of income, moving to the right means that that income distribution is getting worse. And we can see this all the way through as measured by the Gini coefficient, which is simply a measurement of the kind of triangle there, and it's the area inside the circle versus the entire area. And you can see if that number goes up, it's bad, and the number is all above 0.5 or 50%, depending on how you look at it. And so what we see in this period of time, and this is a very gross understatement because this is generally based on the consumption figures, it doesn't include savings, and so it's heading in the wrong direction. And this does our Gini coefficients on average for over a period of 1980s to 2014, and we see rising Gini coefficients based on available data. Inequality of wealth much worse than equality of income. I've just put up the one slide dealing with the enormous divide between a Gini coefficient based on consumption dispersal of 52. But a wealth of 75. So it's really an extraordinary situation to have this degree of inequality of income and wealth in Southern Africa. And the other are areas that are as bad as this, but not too far off. This is our own data coming from our project, which I worked on with Professor Kelly Askew, my colleague at University of Michigan Anthropology, Dr. Rie Odgaard, who has been a retired anthropologist for some years, who dragged out of retirement for some years, working with us from Denmark, the Danish Institute of International Studies, and Professor Fausto Buganga, who's been working with us, who was at the Institute of Resource Assessment at the University of Dar es Salaam, now at St. John's University. The four of us have been working on a project gathering data on income distribution, on impact on poverty measurements, and on the impact of both electricity and private property formalization. And what we can see here is really, for a country that has a socialist past, disturbingly high levels of Gini coefficient, very unequal income distribution. It's based on imputed income analysis. I won't have time to get into the data. Happy to respond if anybody's interested in understanding how we do this. But you can see here across the board, the very best by region distribution of income is still way above the high level of 0.5. And we do a lot of statistical work on what drives all this, which I wouldn't have time to get into. But what we have here is we have, in Kigoma, which has a lot of poor people as well, in the western part of the country, extremely high levels of the maldistribution of income. One of the things we do in our study is we study and return to the same households 5 to 6 years after our initial visit, and what we see is still very, very high levels, and generally some slight decline 5 or 6 years levels at this in the sampling we've done, but in one case the distribution getting worse in the 4 different districts, but still we see is still continuing high levels 5 or 6 years later in the Gini. And so it's one of the things we see is that the Ginis tend to not drop, and if they do, they drop to very small numbers. The kind of status quo typically stays. So overall, our income distribution ranges between 0.38 to 0.80, as we saw across the board, in many cases above 0.6. We look at, and we'll talk a bit about this, some of the drivers of socioeconomic transformation: income inequality, marketing systems, land ownership, access to subsidies through vouchers, availability of inputs in public goods, formalization, access to electricity, credit land holdings. And we do a lot of statistical work, and this won't have time to get into it today, but it reflects in some ways a lot of the disturbing trends that we'll be talking about in the lecture. So we return to kind of the work which is most quoted by mainstream neoclassical economists, the work of Simon Kuznets, who predicted that regions like Africa, with low industrialization and a high reliance on agriculture, would have equitable distribution because land was distributed fairly equitably. There's still a lot of access by the tiller. And so based on the formulation of a mainstream neoclassical theory of distribution, the prediction were that in a competitive market, factors of production should be paid in accordance with their marginal contribution to production. And hence, if the resources they're using, land is fairly evenly distributed, so should be the income. And so that's based on mainstream analysis. Oops.
And the last one you were on there.
We are there. Sorry.
Part 4 is it?
Yeah, well, we got it up here. Sorry. I just made a quick slide. I don't know why I went into this. Sorry, guys. Let's come back in here. Okay, there we go. All right. Okay, so yeah, okay, I'm backwards. I have no idea what I did, but all right. So what we have here is we have the view that peasants receive income commensurate with their land and labor, as suggested. With industrialization, income distribution gets worse. Now, the problem with this is that Africa has not gone through industrialization, and hence this huge level of inequality is not readily explained by the mainstream theory of distribution. And the argument, of course, is that free competition tends to give to labor what labor creates, to capitalist what capital creates, to entrepreneurs what the coordinating function creates, and so hence the share of income accruing to resource owners is given by the exchange value lost if the resources are held back in the production process. So hence the invisible hand of the market ensures that income received is equivalent to the value contributed by the factors of production. And this is still the mainstream theory taught in microeconomics, basically as to what people are paid. The problem with this is it's simply an assertion. There's actually no real basis in reality, because irrespective of what you're producing and what you're contributing, every factor of production is integrated. And the ability to affect production is contingent and interactive. And so it really isn't a good measurement of a product of factor of production. It's purely kind of a normative argument dressed up as objective. So what do I mean by this? Well, so for example, if a worker gets up and leaves the assembly line, probably the next two workers will simply speed up and replace that worker. But if you pull out a piece of equipment, that's probably going to block and break up the continuous flow of the line. In essence, what happens is by nature, production's interactive. And you can't simply say, oh, this person's worth this amount, or that this person goes to the market, you should pay this because this is what they get. Because what determines what's being paid is an absolute understanding of the power you have in the marketplace. And so there's an additional dimension, we'll talk about this, is the issue of efficiency versus equity. So maybe dating myself a little bit, as an undergraduate, it was hammered into me at University of Toronto. There's always a balance and a trade-off between efficiency and equity. So summed up by the work of Oken, who says any assistance on carving the pie into equal slices would shrink the size of the pie. That fact poses a trade-off between economic quality and economic efficiency. And the idea was that somehow redistributing is like a leaky bucket. There's administrative costs, there's a reduction, misdirection of work effort. Somehow it creates less motivation, and hence it reduces the level of efficiency. Even to the point you say, okay, it was 1975, what about recently? Well, you get Robert Lucas, who won the Nobel Prize in 2004. What's his comment? In 2004, it's of the tendencies that are harmful to sound economics, the most seductive, in my opinion, and the most poisonous is the focus on the question of distribution. So the idea is simply, how can you mess with the market? Because the market provides the appropriate rewards for the intrinsic worth of human beings, and how much they contribute to the production process. The market knows best. The market knows what you should be paid. Moreover, it then provides inequality is just a simple symptom of the underlying heart of any incentive system, which compensates people for the comparative talents, their sacrifice, and their risk taking. And so the idea that somehow, if you do not take this into account, you undermine the operation of the economy, it leads to human propensity to shirk and free ride. And so the whole idea is don't disturb the system. The system operates correctly, the market knows what's best, and hence what should transpire is the idea that people are paid in accordance with their worth, what the market tells them. The problem is, as others point out, inequality is a disease. And it cripples people economically and socially from fully participating in the life process. And there are some mainstream economists, Jeffrey Sachs, although I never know which Jeffrey Sachs is talking. Jeffrey Sachs, the father of the shock therapy. Jeffrey Sachs, the inventor, helping invent the Millennium Development Goals. Jeffrey Sachs, who wandered around the world, trying to get himself as the president of the World Bank, knocking on doors. Okay, so many different types of Jeffrey Sachs. So this is Jeffrey Sachs' concern, validly, about inequality. And he says the following: it's hard to see how a society sharply divided between rich and poor could come close to even rudimentary efficiency, much less the high standard of raising every child to its potential. Unequal societies tend to be places of low social trust, unstable politics, and corruption. The rich may shield their incomes from the poor by manipulating politics, the American addiction to unregulated campaign finance, and the cost of social unrest and higher costs of doing business. Society then suffers in two ways: lower national income caused by crime, instability, and corruption, the decrement of psychology, psychological well-being, both the rich and the poor, social tensions, government deteriorations, decline in trust, and mutual support. Hard to argue with them, anybody who's concerned about this. So what's Sachs' solution? Most important thing is people should get more education. That'll solve the problem with more human skills. Hence, more education, productivity rises, leads to higher skills and rewards, and the market will reward you accordingly. The problem is, he in essence is buying into the neoclassical theory of distribution. Inequality, I would argue, is not simply a product of individual choice, but a result of social dynamics that divide people into gender, race, nationality, religion, and class, which form the core of the divisive separation between those enjoying privilege and those undergoing deprivation. The kind of idea that there's a trade-off between efficiency and equity is simply perverse. It justifies the vested interests and maintains a status quo of inequality without discussing the sources of that inequality, because the market knows right. It's telling us the way things should be, given the kind of natural contribution of each individual to production. So we take the field of inequality in health. As an epidemiology professor, I feel a certain responsibility to talk about the health implications here. And there are standard literature two observations. Inequality affects health through psychosocial interpretations and through neo-material interpretations. You have the psychoneuroendocrine approach, which creates stress, smoking, less civic participation. Response to the stress of inequality is central to the interpretation. Perception of place in social hierarchy are translated internally. And hence it focuses on perceptions, not simply material effects. Simply material effects do not explain enough of the impact of inequality on health. In contrast, there's a neo-material interpretation, which checks the differential exposures and experiences due to lack of material resources, underinvestment in human infrastructure, which affects health at the lower level, accounts for larger economic and political process of producing income inequality. And so income inequality by nature leads to health inequalities, and health inequalities can be addressed through material conditions and redistribution. I would just argue you've got to go beyond that into kind of a critical realism approach, where you have the mind-dependent aspects of the world that reaches to understand the mind-independent aspects. It's trying to understand below the surface of positivism on the cause of inequality, to understand what forces are creating that inequality, to be able to address the underlying dimensions of it, not simply saying, oh, let's have redistribution that will solve the problem. Understanding what creates that inequality is central. And so one needs to integrate health effects of inequality with health effects of racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. And it's a call for a kind of international political economy, ontologically positioned outside an empirical frame of studies under a national basis. And it's a kind of notion of bringing in the idea of allostatic load, the huge differentials between the poor and the rich in terms of the wear and tear of their body, by nature, the socioeconomic position of where their standing is in society, which has huge impact even on their chronic disease position, and of course, often their exposure relative to even infectious diseases. We know the impact that COVID-19 has had on the poor, given their underlying susceptibility and vulnerability to their position socioeconomically. This kind of invokes, to some extent, the late Paul Farmer's notion of structural violence. The idea that forms of suffering and injustice are deeply embedded in the ordinary and is taken for granted. It's the same structures that give life and security to some are the same things that create poverty, insecurity, ill health, and violence. These structures are by no nature natural or neutral, and they should be changed. Associated with that is the work of Coburn, who also sees the notion of income inequalities, generating health inequalities, based systemically on the conditions in which you have not only the differentiation of welfare regimes and how goods are provided outside of the market or independent of the market, but also the issue of how economic globalization, neoliberalism, and power of capital distributes that income and in turn has huge impacts on the underlying health condition. We'll talk about examples of this later. And so by nature, this feeds into health and well-being and economic wealth. And hence, a lot of what we saw in terms of the dynamics of income, health, income, and asset inequality in itself is associated with a huge problem in the differential access to the social resources, including work type education, healthcare, housing, etc. And he posits an index of decommodification, which has to do with a degree by which citizens are able to get a standard of living independent of their position in the marketplace. And he clearly shows that neoliberal regimes with countries with similar incomes have huge differences of health indicators compared to those that have higher indices of decommodification. And so in some senses, the view here, and I'll spend a lot of time talking about this now in the remaining time, is to understand inequality, one needs to kind of transcend the neoclassical notion into really understanding the structures and institutions which generate and create the patterns of income distribution, going below the surface to see what impact and the nature that's having on the living conditions of human beings. One of the things which was incredibly important in setting this up in line with the neoliberalism, which of course placed health goods back onto the marketplace, as well as a lot of other very problematic dimensions, is the sense of the understanding of power and what created the transformation. And what's really at the very heart of the determination, the allocation of the shared material wars really is understanding power and who controls it. What you have over time is a movement towards reshaping the context of power and the ability of direct producers, peasants, and workers to access income over time and the share they get of both domestic and global production. We know that following independence, there was some continuation of the terrible distribution of income during the colonial period because they kept some of the same pay scales. Well-connected bureaucrats did well. They had marketing boards, but sometimes continued to pay low prices to some of the peasants. But at the same time, there was the provision of subsidized fertilizer and all sorts of other public goods, which helped the income distribution. One of the things was pan-territorial pricing, which basically gave farmers the same price wherever they were, which was a huge subsidy of transportation costs, access to credit. And so what we could argue is that overall, probably income tended to improve over the period of independence compared to the colonial period. Though distribution, the data is scarce. But what really changed things, which was enormously important, was the arrival of neoliberalism, which really altered the terrain of power and the working rules affecting the transactions of farmers and workers in Africa and the cities. And so there was a massive curtailing of agricultural spending, liberalized. All of a sudden, instead of getting guaranteed prices, farmers got whatever the middlemen got, often with very poor transportation, very few options. They lost access to credit. Basically, the storage facilities dropped down, so they often sold it right at the harvest time. The prices were the lowest, and it really weakened the position of farmers relative to the value added being created. In our 12-year study of 40 villages in Tanzania, we saw farmers sometimes getting 50% of the wholesale price of maize, constant complaints of having to sell everything to middlemen. There also was a massive curtailing of the power of workers, huge amounts of layoffs, with a lot of public spending was cut as a result of structural adjustment, and a dramatic decline in the power of the labor in these countries. In Kenya, wage and salaries spent by the government declined from 31.7% to 15.6%. Proportion of spending on social spending also dramatically declined. At the same time, austerity brought in privatizations and liberalization, and that led to huge closing down parastatal companies in countries, and a huge loss of the power of unions over this time, with the destruction of much of the formal sector in Africa, the loss of the wage laws, and all of this had a dramatic impact at that point in time in formal sector employment. And so people then falling into informal activities, or what often became known in the literature as survival activities, with a huge decline in their standard of living. And so basically, this contributed to a situation where over time, their ability to increase and get large portions of the wage share decline, massive amounts of deindustrialization, increasing reliance on the export of raw materials. Along with these lines was, there was a decline in, as I said, trade union density. I don't have a lot of time to do this. Massive cuts in real health expenditures at a time that user fees were introduced throughout sub-Saharan Africa. One of the examples of user fees was actually the introduction, and when HIV was hitting, of user fees on sexually transmitted disease clinics, even at a time when that was an incredibly important factor as a comorbidity associated with HIV, leading to contribution to the rise in the disease. And so between 1980 and 2003, sub-Saharan Africa under structural adjustment was not just due to AIDS, but also declining social conditions and access to healthcare, had a decline of between 50 and 46 years, and which was just extraordinary, and hitting countries such as Cameroon and Central African Republic, where the HIV effect is much lower than Southern Africa, but still there was significant declines in life expectancy. What also happened is an incredibly important element to this, which is the element of education. And the World Bank and others had put huge pressure on sub-Saharan African countries to cut higher education. They felt this is not where the specialization was. They only, in fact, wanted to actually emphasize primary education. Same time, they put in user fees with primary education, leading to plummeting and a lost generation, even at the primary school level. The higher education was a crisis in all these countries, basically with massive cutbacks. If we look at the arguments, they said, oh, well, they really should be paying their own tuition. It's not something the government should be in. And a huge increase over time on expenditures, which fell by an average of 74% in the 1980s in African universities. Huge staff vacancies. Lecturers simply could not even survive financially, down to $19 a day. Massive staff departures, basically. In Nigeria, salaries down to only 10% by 1992. And at a time when the world was moving towards a specialization in technology, and information technology, higher education went through a massive crisis in sub-Saharan Africa, pushing more and more African countries into marginalization this time and relying increasingly on structures of trade. Inequality basically has also increased with the expansion of global value chains. We need to move kind of more to the international sector. Companies subdivide, and divide activities on a host of production, coordination, transportation, technological costs. Networks have extended across space with little regard to national boundaries. And what's been really crucial in all of this is a massive financialization, where increasingly what really drives a transformation is the motives, financial motives, financial practices. Among corporations, increasingly emphasis was on paying shareholders in larger amounts of dividends, simply taking profits as buybacks, raising stock market prices, so those that were in managerial positions would get rewarded with very high levels of their stock options, and squeezing labor and costs throughout the world, putting pressure worldwide, basically, but even worse at the lower end, because in sub-Saharan Africa, which emphasized the production of raw materials, they tended to be at the very lowest end of the global distribution of value. And as a result, as they participated with higher and higher percentage of reliance of exports and unprocessed raw materials, they tended to get a smaller and smaller percentage of the global distribution of value added. And so African countries then increased the reliance on unprocessed raw materials. And at the time, basically, governments began to alter the terms and conditions of international capital flows with privatizing state enterprises and liberalizing trade. And so in essence, what ended up happening is that as production went global, Africa found itself at the very lowest level, basically, with the smallest percentage of value added over time. So from UNCTAD exports to 2000s in Africa increased without any substantial increase in domestic value added, meaning less available to pay for wages and raise the standard of living in sub-Saharan Africa. So those that were wealthy and could contribute in these global financial flows, they would gain from it. For those that had some participation on higher ends of international trade, they could gain from it. But for the vast majority of the country as direct producers, they did not gain from it. And that dramatically changed and exacerbated the income distribution in these countries. What also is really crucial is the global financial system and the architecture in which you have a hierarchy of currencies that's helped determine how countries interact with the global economy. Africa finds itself at the very lowest end of the hierarchy. Basically, currencies are unstable, there's no international circulation, and there's often constant pressure to accumulate dollars, which in some senses, once again, even though, and we'll talk about what they've had to do, they've been unable to avoid yet another debt crisis, which we currently find in sub-Saharan Africa. And so what ended up happening is that commodity price shocks create balance of payments crisis, which forces African countries to go into their national monetary fund since the 80s, which brings it conditions of fiscal austerity, interest rate increases, and pushes economies into deeper economic downturns from their pro-cyclical policies. And so poor countries in Africa have gone to great lengths to avoid the IMF. So every time what they attempt to do is build up their hard currency reserves for the purposes of avoiding a situation when there's an economic downturn. The problem is these expansion of foreign exchange reserves hypothetically could provide resources to help these economies diversify economies away from this commodity dependence. But basically what happens is the pressure then to when commodity export prices are up, the pressure is accumulated reserves, and those reserves tend to be deposited in dollar reserves, adding to dollar hegemony. At the same time, they're not brought back to begin to utilize and invest in these countries to diversify these economies. And it creates then what I refer to as a vicious cycle of commodity dependence, where being dependent on commodity creates the conditions that keep you dependent on commodities. And this process keeps the status quo and tends to feed in to the dynamics of inequality, which is exacerbated by the way that African countries are basically integrated with the global economy. I'm taking up a lot of time, and I want to finish up with a few conclusions in a couple of minutes. So after 2000, the World Bank bias against tertiary education began to change because private returns to tertiary education in low-income countries, they argue, are now frequently on par with the returns from primary education. And what kind of nonsense is this? Oh, okay, you guys can now expand your universities again. Well, it's all we get the same values. But in the process, you read the documents as I did coming out of the 80s and 90s, and it just was hair pulling to talk about, oh, Africa really doesn't need higher education. It was a horrible tragedy done by this complete misconceptualization of the development process, driven because of the dominance of neoclassical economics at the World Bank and among donor agencies. And the view was, okay, now human capital is the growth in neoclassical terms that would enable African economies to increase allocated efficiency, maximize returns, limited supplies of physical capital. The problem with this approach is that it ignores the broader structural configuration of African economies, which have performed poorly in generating job opportunities that could help improve economic distribution and income distribution. And obviously, the key really movement is to move people from comparatively low value added into higher value activities for poverty reduction, yield income distribution. By nature, institutional economists like myself recognize that development requires structural transformation and that markets are not going to provide that. There has to be a systematic set of alternative policies, often industrial policy, that can begin to move economies systematically towards industrialization, higher value added jobs, the potential to increase the income of direct producers. The same goes for alternative set of supportive policies in the agricultural sector, which has to do, of course, changing the whole nature of the availability of goods and price supports and supports of fertilizer, et cetera, and land distribution to begin to change the nature of how production is transpiring in the countryside. So the institutional approach to the distribution of income really needs to understand power and its relationship to the contestation of interests, which are really at the heart of the determination of the allocation of the shares of material worlds. Power in a market context is related to transactions in which the working rules of transactions reflect the shifting nature of power asymmetries. What's key here, as I've tried to argue, is understanding the forces that select working rules and shape and reshape relative power of the parties' transactions. And it should be at the core of the complete rethinking and reevaluation, reconceptualization, and alternative policy agendas that can deal with the distribution of income in any society and how the global economic system operates. In essence, what one needs is a new set of constructs that can begin to understand and address and come up with alternative policy approaches to deal with this issue of income inequality. And hence, that which the dynamics underlying income inequality also reflect the disturbing nature of what is transpiring in the world to create those conditions of inequality. And so understanding the nature of that is the very center of power, and identifying the sources that reproduces inequality in the world in some ways is exacerbating inequality over time. And so that means actually generating these new set of constructs, thinking it through. However, I'm out of time, and we'll have to wait till another lecture in the future where I perhaps begin to lay out some of these constructs. Thank you all for listening. I will take any questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Howard, for that, and for an excellent critique of neoliberalism, I have to say, and the impact of the trajectory of this hierarchy of power indeed on Africa and the most vulnerable. We've 5 minutes for questions, and I know that
Something in the chat room.
I'll bring us back. What happened?
We've got a great lecture. Thank you so much. Okay. All right.
Please stop sharing, and we're back. Okay, can you hear us okay, Petronella?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Yeah. Okay. Did you catch that last bit? Me sort of thanking hard?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Well, maybe if we have a couple of questions, and then we can leave it at that. Does anyone want to start there in regards to the questions before I interject with a particular topic of the moment?
Yeah, well, we had a great question answer session on Tuesday with lots of good questions. I'm still really kind of wondering what the kind of the international financial institutions can do at this stage to redeem themselves. Is there anything? Is there, are there? I mean, is there anything they can do to contribute to so supporting countries to move to a system that that will work to reduce income inequality in African countries? And I also kind of wonder, it's a second question really, are there any other innovative kind of ways of creating of financing for international development that go beyond the kind of both the neoliberal system and also the kind of mainly neoliberal actors? I mean, I certainly observe kind of how the African Union very often fails to work kind of in, kind of creating coherent policies and strategies and work kind of effectively together for the greater good of various countries. So I'm just really wondering whether there are any other movements out there that are, that may, yeah, that could potentially make progress. Thanks.
Okay, let me respond really quickly to that. Thanks so much, Pernell. And there were some really wonderful questions, if you want to repeat them, if we'll have time. But basically, one has to remember who the international financial institutions are, and who they actually serve. And that's very problematic because we need a new international financial system. If we were serious about really avoiding the enormous hierarchy in currencies, and what is in essence a position in which the dollar hegemony gives the United States huge privileges that the rest of the world does not get, then we'd understand that we have to change the nature of the financial system. The US basically produces dollars with no cost and has a free ride on macroeconomic policy and on bonds, where the rest of the world has a comparatively more difficult position, with Africa being in the worst, because their currencies simply do not circulate. They can't buy anything they need. And they have to then dramatically transform their economies to be able to deal with it. So one of the problems is there's a lot of vested interests in the way the international financial institutions operate. And it's hard to say, hey, can you guys do a better job, without recognizing who they represent, and whether they're actually going to challenge the very nature of the system, given the power structures inside those organizations. The second dimension, which is very challenging, is the issue of economic theory. These are still overwhelmingly dominated by neoclassical economists, have their way of looking at the world, that don't really want to open up the education into the multiplicity of economic paradigms, or what they call heterodox economics, or people operating in other ways of looking at the world. It used to be development economics, much more broadly defined as I was taught it, when I was in my early years at places like the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex. And unfortunately, there's got to be an opening in that, but you've got power structures which impede it, and economic theory which impedes it. And it's very difficult to begin to break that system. So myself and others have been critiquing this for a very, very long time. What's happening in the world now is not very surprising, that Africa is back in another debt crisis. So that's the real issue here. Anyway, go ahead. But no,
Okay.
Thanks very much. I maybe Jared, I'll leave you to ask the follow-up questions.
Okay. Maybe just another couple of questions around neoliberalism indeed. The events in Eastern Europe recently have changed the global dynamic in terms of ideology and power relations. The impact on Africa has been quite traumatic and dramatic. And we've seen in the past week or so that sort of rolling aspect of the Ukrainian war across the Sahel, with the conflict in Sudan in particular, having an aspect of the Ukrainian war involved in that, different ways, particularly in Port Sudan. The question being, there's a profound ideological shift going on at the minute. It's having a devastating impact around the globe. Can you anticipate any way out of that particular difficulty, or indeed economic shifts that could get some sort of balance in regards to the global economic system?
Well, what I'd argue, of course, that there's never a simple relationship between the politics and the economics. But there's little doubt that the inability to provide shared wealth and shared growth creates a lot of disaffection in the world, and allows people to be open to what we now is disturbingly autocratic or worse trends. I mean, let's face it, it's actually, we're looking at potential widespread fascist movement. One never would have thought that this would be seen again. And you'd hope this would be an opportunity. I mean, following, we look at this period, it begins to look like the 1920s and the 30s again. It's something my father, who recently passed away, who was a World War II vet, talked about. He said how disturbing it was to see this the same forces of darkness kind of rising again in the world. And so you'd hope, and what came out of course, was redistribution, Keynesian policies, the role of the state was played at a very effectively, much greater controls on financial flows, and a situation in which they began to address the areas of maldistribution of income, because there was some recognition that disaffection was also created, by very, very harsh economic conditions, as Keynes pointed out with the Treaty of Versailles, the terrible tax that was placed on the Germans and the terrible economic downturn. And so one would think the hope of this moment that powers to be would recognize you've got to change the nature of the current system, which rewards and keeps reproducing this high levels of wealth. Even by beginning to think of changing the taxation system, redistribution. And so you hope this moment will be one to go forward. But sadly, instead what we're seeing is lots of dark money going in to support the reproduction and maintenance of the system with even sort of greater cuts in taxes. Look how much effort it took even to get a minimum tax on global corporations, worldwide. And so you hope this crisis is a moment to begin to rethink the system of the maldistribution of income, which is helping to create this. But it's unfortunately, we don't see this kind of debates and these kind of discussions, that we hope to see at this moment, where there's this understanding of the nature of these forces. We have to find ways to share the resources of wealth in the world in a manner which is inclusive of all human beings, not these notions of these false economic ideas that this is somehow a natural system that comes out of the natural market and that's the best way to approach things. So am I optimistic? I would say you hope at this moment there will be some serious rethinking, but unfortunately I have yet to see it, and that's kind of worrying.
Okay, I think in terms of challenging neoclassical economics, I mean that's the fight that has been ongoing for many years. It feeds into neoliberalism. Neoliberalism obscurely has fed into global conflict at the minute, particularly through the emergence of oligarchical corporations. As for my reading of it in terms of neo-Keynesianism and the way in which that has re-emerged, I have to say there is a conversation being generated at the minute around neo-Keynesianism. But I do think, and this will probably come back to Petronella's sort of opinions on this and from various conversations we've had around this. The idea that degrowth can offer an opportunity for change, but degrowth essentially has to come from the global north, as in the suggestion being the answers to a lot of the power imbalance north and south happens in the north, and the pressure in the global north that we need to put on politicians and the economy itself. Can I just ask, is there any other considerations or thoughts before we maybe ask Howard to sum up on his views and thoughts of this afternoon? Any other questions at all? No, we're good.
I want to take one or two things up at the end.
Okay, well, if we get that
running out of time. Is there any other questions?
I think people are okay at this point.
Not from me, and I'm going to have to say goodbye because I actually have a pressing appointment here in a minute. So I'd really like to thank you for a great lecture. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And at that, the last part, maybe to sum up, and we leave it at that with our thanks.
The last point I really want to make is there's a lot of money floating around the world to maintain the system, and sadly, you have this phenomenon in the United States in which a lot of wealth is going in to propel up things that divide us, the cultural wars that's going on in the United States, in order to maintain power. And it's important that we lay all of this out as going forward and how that is being misused in a manner which is undermining global harmony, global unity, to be able to face what are a series of really existential problems, including the climate change, which I've barely talked about. So let me sum up by saying, it's another crisis in Africa, and let us hope, and a crisis that continues in the Sudan being the latest manifestation of this, that perhaps we need to sit back, take a breath, and begin to have some openness in the discussions that does not deny an understanding of how the economy and its relationship operates, simply because you have a series of preconceived notions. So the hope here as we go forward is we need to be open-minded, consider other ideas of looking at the world, not think we all have the answers. And perhaps with a little humility, perhaps we can all go forward to open up these discussions. And in my own little way, we'll try to, in my little lecture today, to throw out a few ideas, and begin to open up, not with all the answers, but to open up and understand the nature of the problems that we face, and hopefully begin to kind of address some of the solutions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Hart. And with that, I'd like to thank Hart for taking the time out to come to Ireland or South to present this case, and hopefully we can carry forward some of the issues that have been brought up today and in Dublin on Tuesday. I'd like to just finally thank the DSAI for facilitating this. Petronella, obviously, Miriam, Kira, and Padraig in particular, who have really helped you organize your visit and made it the success it has been. So appreciate that. And thank you everyone for attending, and indeed, let's continue this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Marion, close it now.